I was thinking a lot about the panel that we're about to participate in together, because it gets to the very core of why this wonderful event was pulled together. And I've done clinical trials looking at the role of religion in healing. It introduces all kinds of subtleties, like what are you actually praying for if there's prayer used, or how do you reconcile healing goals with meaning goals? And I can't think of three better people to have this discussion than to pick on individuals who are leaders in their faith communities who also happen to be well-recognized physicians. So if I can ask Reverend Dr. and Father Kevin FitzGerald, and Rabbi, and Dr. Edward Reichman, and Elder and Dr. Dale Renlund, please join me on the panel. So let me start with the broad question of the role of a faith-based life in healing. And I'll just touch on this clinical trial that I was very closely linked in, where we had people get prayed for, even remotely prayed for, when they're having cardiac catheterization. And interestingly, the outcomes of that trial were very hard to interpret because it sort of depended on what was being prayed for. Were you being prayed for a successful stent placement, or were you having a prayer that said, hey, thy will be done? Where sometimes the best result isn't a successful stent placement because you're suffering from advanced Alzheimer's or some other comorbidity that will hold you back. I promised the panel that I would leave these as open questions, general. I think they'll play well in the sandbox. So whoever desires to take this first question, run with it. Father, you're closest, so.
Who picked this order?
Right. That's right.
So first of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here with all of you to discuss these issues and to begin to answer the question. I think particularly when one is dealing with God, it's probably not good to come up with a specific stent that you want to ask for, because you never know what investments God has and who he's favoring on that particular occasion. But I think, again, it gets back to what is it you want? You know, what are the goals? And if somebody has in mind that sense of, as you said, thy will be done, but a hopeful thy will be done. In other words, it's a merciful, loving God that has your best interests at heart. So you may think that that particular stent is your best option, but God might know a little more. So the idea would be that you live a life that is open to surprise, discovery, to the possibility that there may be a way even more meaningful and fulfilling for you to go, even in the midst of your clinical trial, than you anticipate. So that may, in fact, it would be an interesting variable to bring into the analysis to see what the people were praying for or thought people were praying for them in terms of breaking up maybe some of those confounding results. So I'd be fascinated to go back and restructure it that way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Oz. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith, and the Vatican and the Quorum Foundation for the tremendous privilege it is for me as an individual to be here amongst these extraordinary people, to be representing the Jewish faith. We welcome this initiative wholeheartedly, not only with our whole hearts, but with our stem cells, with our bone marrow, with our DNA. Since this is a panel about religion, I just want to open with the following story. There's a story of a scientist who has the audacity to approach God and to say, God, since the times of the Bible, we've accomplished quite a bit. We have respirators, we have antibiotics, we have chemotherapy, we have stem cells, we have tremendous ways to advance healthcare. We have cloning, we can even create man, just like you did at the beginning. In fact, God, I'm not so sure we need you anymore. So God says to the scientists, you can create man, how do you do such a thing? So he says, well, we take some dirt, we bring it to the laboratory, we inject some enzymes. So God says, why don't you show me? So the man proceeds to bend down and pick up the dirt, and God says, no, no, no. You get your own dirt.
Right.
And the truth is that scientists genuinely believe that they can control every dimension of life from before life to after death. We as religionists, as members of faith, believe that God controls every dimension of our life. And in fact, the extraordinary discussion that you heard at the very beginning of this conference about the advances that are occurring, we believe is all divine providence, that we are privy to this. And I really thank Dr. Smith for bringing religion into the discussion of science, because when the two are separate, that's when the dangers occur. When religion begins to inform science, of course it doesn't dictate, but inform science, I think these kinds of healthy conversations really carry things in a much more meaningful fashion, and hopefully we'll be able to anticipate some of these dangers and be able to prevent them from occurring. But in response to the question, Dr. Oz actually mentions a type of research called intercessory prayer, where people pray on behalf of others unbeknownst to them. And I think it reflects this certain desire by scientists to even scientifically address religion. And I'm not so sure how fruitful an endeavor that is. I think, as the joke sort of illustrates, it's really God sort of designs what's happening in this world, while religion informs science, and indeed science informs religion as well. I'm not sure if we can quantify in a clear fashion how prayer affects the care of the ill patient.
Elder Renlund, just as a trialist and a heart failure specialist, so you dealt with end-of-life issues in the course since we share a specialty. What is the proof that religion makes a difference in how folks do? And any other opening comments you desire?
First, I'd like to quote Mordecai Kaplan, who said, expecting life to treat you fairly simply because you're an honest man is like expecting the bull not to charge you simply because you're a vegetarian. So difficult things happen to people. And from a personal point of view, the thing that everyone faces difficulties. Rain, wind, and floods come to everybody. And the real thing that religion can do is one can pray for strength to be able to go through it and get the help that one needs. And I know that from personal experience and from observing others of faith, different faiths, go through the challenges that they face. And so proof is going to be a subjective thing in this, but it makes a difference to those of faith as they go through a challenge, as they have belief in a higher being, that their life has purpose. That brings them comfort and gives them the strength to go through. And that's what I pray for in going through trials.
So if religion can play a role in helping us find strength and maybe even find better outcomes, should clinicians be concerned with the religious practices of their patients?
If I may, I think that we heard at the beginning about how we take cure and humanism. And how can a doctor, how can a physician care for a patient without being concerned about humanism and about that person's situation and what they're thinking and what they're feeling and the fears they're going through? And if his faith or her faith can help him, I think the physician should encourage that as opposed to ridicule or diminish that faith.
Rabbi?
There's no question that religion is an integral part of healing. So by not addressing religion, you're really not addressing an integral part of the healing process for each individual. Of course, you would defer to each individual whether they would want to have that discussion with the physician. But in addition to that dimension, there's a practical dimension. Some religions have certain practices which might run counter to some of the prescriptions that you have. So, for example, as a practitioner of the Jewish religion, we have certain restrictions on the Sabbath. We have certain restrictions on eating. So, for example, one might think that if I know Elder Renlund was a cardiologist, if you're an Orthodox Jew and the physician offers you a valve which comes from a pig, that could potentially be a problem to a Jew. In fact, it is not. The prohibition is only ingesting, but not necessarily placing inside the body, and for sure not for therapeutic purposes. But if you're not deferring to the person's religious beliefs, you won't be an effective clinician on both of these levels, both in terms of the general healing and just practically in terms of understanding how the patient functions.
So we heard earlier that we are now in the age of big data. And the whole idea is we need all that data about a person to be able to put it together and find the targeted therapy, right? The personalized therapy for that person. So if you have a patient, of course you're going to ask the patient about familiar relationships, stress at work. All of those things are going to affect the healing process. So why wouldn't you ask, or at least make it available to discuss about the person's religious beliefs, which could, of course, also contribute to that healing process, to that sense the patient will have of the patient's own empowerment in the healing process, of the patient's own involvement and engagement in it, and to have that sense that the healthcare professionals are with me in this, in all of the various aspects of my life. And because, I mean, again, if we're going to talk about this kind of personalized precision medicine, then obviously it would be important to recognize the things that are important to the patient.
So I was taught by Oprah early in my career, ask the questions the folks at home are wondering. So if it was so evident, we would all already be doing this, but we're not. So I did a survey at Columbia University, where I'm on the faculty. So it's actually an IRB-approved process, even for this question, but you'll find out why in a second. And I asked, did you want to talk about religion? And did you want to talk about religion with your doctor? The answer to the first question, overwhelmingly yes. The answer to the second question, overwhelmingly no. In fact, less than 20% of patients were comfortable talking to their doctor, or at least in the survey responded they wanted their doctor to talk to them about it. There are a couple of explanations. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, though, and I suspect the main reason patients did not want to talk to their doctor was they had a precious few seconds of time. They wanted to focus on their heart valve or whatever else was plaguing them. And secondly, I think they were worried they might disrupt that precious covenant they had with their physician if something in that very sensitive discussion about religion didn't go down right. And they had some fundamental disagreements about doctrine, which shouldn't influence with how hard the doctor tries to stop the bleeder in the middle of the operating room, which I know sitting here we all chortle at, but these are real concerns that hold people back from talking to their doctor as opposed to their pastor or spiritual guide. So, Elder Dale?
I think physicians should be very open and welcoming of the discussion. And I think that receptivity is something that will foster more discussion. I think that one of the explanations for the data is that many want to view people as not being able to wear two hats at the same time. In other words, that if I'm a physician and I have a certain faith, they want me because I'm a physician, not because of my faith. And they're keeping those things separate. In my mind, if someone comes to me and they're saying, who is a good Latter-day Saint cardiac surgeon, I say, you're asking the wrong question. You should ask, who is a good cardiac surgeon? If he or she happens to be LDS, fine, but find the good cardiac surgeon. And I think that's part of what leads to that dichotomy.
The truth is I have a little advantage because I'm a distinctly religious person. So it very often opens the door for patients to discuss religion with me because they wouldn't otherwise know. And doctors don't necessarily, or I would say almost always, if not always, don't share their personal religious beliefs with their patients. And in fact, we're often taught not to share our religious beliefs specifically with our patients. So I have a certain luxury that patients will often address matters of religion with me, which I enjoy tremendously, of all different faiths, not just patients of the Jewish faith, but of all different faiths. But one factor, this is very nice theoretical discussion. Unfortunately, if I can inject a little practicality in here, for those of you who are clinicians, you will fully understand this. Elder Renlund, when he was practicing cardiology 20, 30 years ago, you would have time to discuss things with your patients. Today, as all of us clinicians know, we have to see literally twice as many or 3 times as many patients in the same time frame. Regretfully, we don't have the time barely to cover the medical aspects, let alone to cover to the religious aspects. So I hope that with conferences like this, where we can create some extraordinary cures, maybe we can restore the days where physicians actually have time to discuss religion with their patients, which would be therapeutic and curative.
Father FitzGerald?
So on that note, I mean, one of the things that you see in hospitals nowadays, of course, is the team approach to patients, right? And it can be done well where the entire team is aware of a patient's particular religious perspective and values. If indeed the patient wants an in-depth conversation, I work at a Catholic hospital, so we work to make sure that they have that opportunity with pastoral care, with whatever faith tradition they want to engage. That's fine with us. But also it's important that they feel comfortable, even in those few minutes they may have with their cardiologist or whomever the specialist happens to be, to have the freedom to bring up the issue, even if, as you say, sadly, too often there isn't time for an in-depth discussion. So if the team is comfortable, if the team is aware of the need to be able to support each other, so that whenever the patient has the need to discuss those things, that need is addressed.
So when you go around the world and look at places where people live a long time, and this has been characterized by a variety of terms, blue zones being a particularly powerful one of late, and I try to tease out what is it that lets people live unexpectedly longer than they generally would have been expected to survive. Having a faith of some type ends up becoming one of those variables. What factors of having a faith contribute to that? And it doesn't, I don't think, stop with believing. It stops with other elements articulated by faith-based institutions. And I think this will lead us into the broader discussion about how you bring religion more into the organized medicine realm. Whoever decides to go first. Elder Renlund?
First of all, having spent a career dealing with heart failure, usually late stage, and then heart transplantation and ventricular assist devices and the like, those things almost, or many times, represent a failure of prevention and early detection and vigorous treatment. And so it's fascinating to have, as part of this discussion, as we're talking about cures and things, to take the time and talk about what really is preventive. I believe that the data show quite clearly that strong sociality, especially in families, is very healthy in terms of prolonging life. The strong social support is there. Additionally, recent data show that a spirit of volunteerism also contributes. So these societal norms that are taught by religions of doing good to one another, which is found in many faith traditions, leads to improved survival. The most recent data show that in adolescence, volunteerism, particularly towards strangers, is associated with less anxiety and less aggression. Good things. And that is a factor that is not religion specific, but certainly is fostered by religion. So strong society, strong family or social networks and volunteerism, doing good, is one thing or two things that religion brings.
Rabbi, I can add to that, but also bring in dietary issues, other habits that go beyond caring for the fellow man.
In 1833, the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints believed that God revealed a health code, and it included no alcohol, tobacco, coffee, tea, meat sparingly, and a reliance on vegetables and fruits and grains. That's called the Word of Wisdom, 1833. And it's fascinating that starting in the 1980s at UCLA, people started to study epidemiologically whether Mormons lived longer. And it turned out they did, and they tried to focus on, was it this word of wisdom that made a difference? And if you look at it, the average 7.3 years longer that a practicing Mormon male lived, 1.5 of those years added was due to abstinence from tobacco. And then the other things added up. But certainly it's those other things that also contribute.
Just to be clear, so out of the 7.5 years roughly, only 1.5, so 20%.
Was from tobacco, abstinence from tobacco.
Just tobacco. Okay.
Just tobacco. Other things that in this particular study looked at maintaining a reasonable BMI, exercise, and a thing for most of us who are jet lagged, adequate sleep was also found to be beneficial, as well as the factors of being married, education through 12 years, and then going to church once a week. Those were the things that seemed to add to longevity. And certainly part of that is certainly plant-based and dietary in nature.
We're talking about plant-based food later this morning, but it's interesting it comes up in the words of wisdom. Rabbi?
So it's not only the practice of religion itself, it's the dictates of the religion. So in the Jewish tradition, which has a very rich tradition of the practice of health for thousands of years, the Jews actually require health practices as an integral part of our religion. I'll share with you a quote from Maimonides. Maimonides lived in the 12th century. One of the greatest figures in our history. Maimonides was a world-renowned physician at his time. He was the physician to the king of Egypt, and he wrote the definitive code of Jewish law at his time in the 12th century. To give you an idea of the application of his code, it's still studied to this day, literally every single day in religious institutions across the globe. So Maimonides codified, not in his medical writings, in his legal writings, he codified the following. Since maintaining a healthy and sound body is among the ways of God, for one cannot understand or have any knowledge of the Creator when he is sick, therefore he must avoid that which harms the body and accustom himself to that which is healthful and helps the body become stronger. And he actually went on to detail exactly how that can be done, even including recommendations about how long one should sleep, when one should eat, et cetera, et cetera. And in terms of other behaviors, Judaism actually proscribes behaviors that can cause you harm. So while this wasn't true 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, today, you mentioned smoking, there are rabbis who say it's not just suggested that you don't smoke, it's actually prohibited to smoke, according to the Jewish law. So it's not an option. Of course, not all rabbis say that, and there is varied practice.
Well, why is that debated? Wouldn't that be somewhere along the 2,000 or more years of Judaism, 3,500 years of Judaism? Someone sort of either said yes or no on something as strategic as that.
Good. So let me share with you the principle in Jewish law. 2 rabbis, 3 opinions. That basically sums it up.
That was cardio.
So as opposed to the Catholic Church, which has a central body, the Jewish tradition, while in ancient times, at the times that the temple stood, there was a central body called the Sanhedrin, as was its name. Today, there is no central legal body. So the way Judaism is practiced today is rabbis adjudicate the law based on their interpretation of the codes. So there are many different interpretations of the law. So that's why there is
What's
no
yours?
unanimity. So I think smoking should be prohibited. I think so. But let me just share with you a fascinating study. He talked about practice of religion. So one of my colleagues at Yeshiva University, Eliezer Schnall, was the lead author on a landmark study derived from data from the Women's Health Initiative, surveying over 90,000 women. And the conclusions of the study show that women age 50 and up were 20% less likely to die in any given year if they attended religious services weekly, compared to those who never attend religious services. This analysis was controlled for age, ethnicity, income level, and current health status.
Jeez.
fascinating.
remarkable.
Obviously, there's what to talk about. It's an involved study, but just
What about
an
once a
interesting
month? How do they
observation.
do? What about the Easter Christmas guys? How do they fare?
You've got to up your game.
My mother-in-law's a minister. You got it covered at home, I think.
So taking the comments about social connections and this sort of network of meaning in one's life and what that does, I think I worked 3.5 years on a Indian reservation in South Dakota. And one of the things I constantly heard, especially from physicians who would come there, was criticism about the sort of living habits of the people on the reservation. Why were they drinking too much, smoking, eating the wrong things, and all this sort of thing? And what I think was missed was the idea of why do any of us want to live longer? So here were people that looked to the future, and it wasn't particularly rosy. So why not live for now? Why not get whatever you could get now and recognize that was at the expense of what might come later? Again, because of that social context, because there was, in a sense, so little hope and such a source of little belief that things were going to significantly change. And again, that's why I think when religious organizations come into an area like that, into a community context like that, and say, even in the midst of all your problems and challenges, there is hope. There is a way forward. We can work together, regardless of how bleak the circumstances, and get beyond where we are. You can see those outcomes. You can see things change. And you can see people then wanting to make decisions that may be more difficult in the short run in order for long-term benefit, not just for themselves, but even for future generations. And so I think when we look at this explosion of technology that we're going to be dealing with over the next few days, and as we heard this morning, we're all going to have however many gigabytes available to us, probably in a chip implanted in the back of our skull, so we can beam right up to the satellite and all. I also find it fascinating that one of the big movements you hear about today is the movement to unplug, to turn off your phone, to get away, to close it all down. Why? Because it's a good thing for us to take time to reflect, to put things into perspective, to be able to look at that explosion of technology and options and all the things that are before us and be able to step back and say, why am I doing this? To what end? To what goal? To what good? To whose benefit? Because if you do that, then that helps you re-engage and put that tsunami of technology into perspective, to get above it so it doesn't knock you over and drown you, but instead provides a surface upon which you might surf, or float at least, and move forward.
So go on, Rabbi.
So we have that built into our religious system. We have a word for that. It's called the Sabbath. On the Sabbath, we do not use any electricity whatsoever, which means that, and my children obviously are using more technology than I am, although arguably. So our phones go off, our tablets go off, our computers go off for roughly 24 hours. And that's inviolate. We can't in any way, shape, or form use them. There's no exceptions. Of course, I'm a physician, so if there's the exception is, if there's an emergency, if I have a medical emergency, then of course I can use my phone beyond a shadow of a doubt. So the irony is that the unplugging is actually the ideal form of recharging. And people, it's so funny because people look at us and they say, how could you possibly do that? I mean, I can't quote the details of the studies, but the average person looks at their email or texts, how many times an hour, how many times a day. To be able to stop for an hour for many of us is difficult. Do it for 24 hours seems insurmountable. But it is a true remedy, and it's a real blessing.
Elder Renlund, in 1833, when the words of wisdom were written, there were no cell phones. So, like many religions, you have to have a philosophy that adapts to changing technology. So, the once a week effort, called beginner's luck in Judaism, because you manage to block out something that happened to be electrical. But if this wasn't electrical, and one day it won't be, and when we do have a chip implanted in our head, we may not have to have electricity involved with it. So I could see us even jumping past that very wise sage advice of taking one day a week and just blocking everything that could influence you. But how does LDS deal with the epidemic of loneliness, which is probably the biggest complaint and fear that I hear from my audience? And my show's in 100 countries, so I hear it worldwide. It's not just in the U.S. How does religion adapt to new technologies at a broad level? But specifically, how do you give advice to a young generation that is pulled in so many directions, especially by social media, which changes their self-esteem in ways that are profoundly unassailable by their parents?
First, to comment on the Sabbath, because as a medical student, I simply decided I wouldn't study on the Sabbath as a sign to God. And then I asked for the help that I could be more efficient those other days. And that turned out for me to be a blessing, that it helped me. And so I think it's sage advice to do what is done in some form or another in that way. I think that religions have got to look at being quite connected with each other. The data that shows you get together once a week on the Sabbath, is it related to worship? I think there's a part of it, but it's also related to getting together with others and bonding with others. And the number of times in my life that I've gone to church and somebody has said, "Oh, Dale, you didn't gain weight this week," and I feel great, or somebody makes some comment that is uplifting and positive. And I think it's the same thing, especially among youth, that they need to go and connect with their peers instead of being lonely, instead of being holed up in their home on their devices, that they're out. They have opportunities to work with others. They get opportunities to work with a wide spectrum of people with different ages and different backgrounds, and those things contribute. So the question about how does a religion deal with this is by coming together as a faith community and figuring out what it is God wants them to do, and then trying to accomplish that, working together.
Father, I just want to, as you answer or offer your thoughts, move past just the Sabbath to the day-to-day, minute-to-minute guidance that is often needed to cope with some of these intrusions into the sanity, the time, the space that you need to be able to figure life out.
Thank you for that. I did not prompt him at all in that regard, because that's where I was going to go. So, again, we're going to talk a lot about the rapid increase of knowledge that's going on right now. You've heard about this already this morning. There'll be a lot more. I'd like to ask us, as we listen to that, to extend beyond and recognize that it's just knowledge. Knowledge isn't the answer. We always try to move beyond knowledge to wisdom. And one of the interesting things is, in religious traditions, particularly the one next to me here, they've been around for a few thousand years. They've seen technological advances. The Catholic Church has been here for about 2,000 years and has had to deal with them too. So there is a reservoir of wisdom there in how do you deal with disruptive technologies? How do you integrate that into your life in a positive way? Now, unlike rabbis, when you have two, you have three opinions. With Jesuits, you have at least 5 opinions if they're 2 Jesuits, and that's just for starters. So the idea is, how do you take a complex situation and find what's right for you in your circumstances? And granted, there may be a situation where, for instance, if a healthcare professional is working in an area where you cannot take off 24 hours because you're the only healthcare professional serving a radius of, say, 500 kilometers. How do you adjust? Again, the argument would be, well, look at your structured day. Try to find time somewhere. Try to build in, instead of a traditional day a week, hour a day. Something like that, at least, so that there's a rhythm to your life so you can get back to those fundamental goals and goods that you're pursuing. So to get back to the question about youth, you know, we can all remember back. I know it was quite a while, but some of the memories are still there. And recognize the fact that you're focused on different things. Fine. Engage them where they are. What is it you're hoping for? Are you hoping for loneliness? I doubt it. So if you're feeling lonely, in spite of all the connections that you have, ask yourself, as a teenager, what's going on, right? Again, from our Jewish colleagues, we recognize the fact that, you know, we debate, when does human life begin? And of course, in the Catholic Church, we understand that human life begins during that process of conception. I understand in the Jewish tradition, life begins once you get your MD or JD. Isn't that correct? Yeah, okay.
He'll be here all week, by the way.
Right.
Try the corned beef. Unbelievable.
It is Irish. No, okay. So the idea is engage the person where they are, where the struggles are, where the challenges are, but also where the hopes and desires are, and say, how do we do a better job integrating these technologies and the great benefit and good that they could provide, put them in a context, and let them build on your hopes and desires and not contribute to your fears and confusion.
Go ahead, Rabbi.
So we just talked about the Sabbath and not using technology. This is one of the areas where technology has tremendous advantages. You know, I think this study was done attending, you know, some synagogue service. I think the future study is going to be attending some virtual service, not necessarily in the presence or in a synagogue, but perhaps in some virtual environment. And of course, you know, every faith community focuses on preventing loneliness. That's part of our objective, is to create community. That's our sole purpose, or one of our many purposes, to create community. But today, for those who can't physically go, don't want to physically go, they can join virtual communities. And I know we're not the only religion that's embarking on these kinds of initiatives, but there are many people who are creating these global virtual communities where people can tap in, sometimes by video, sometimes by audio, sometimes in live feed, so they can actually be part of a service in the comfort of their own home. So it's really quite an extraordinary generation.
Elder Renlund.
I think the ultimate loneliness is life without God, is thinking that life has no purpose beyond the here and now, and that really connecting with God brings meaning and purpose into life. Now, I know that the plural of anecdote isn't data, but let me just, I remember taking care of a man who had a left ventricular assist device, followed by a failed heart transplant, and then finally the next heart transplant. And I recognize when you go through something like that, you use up all your coping coupons. But on day 8 of the second transplant, he was going to be discharged the next day. He'd go on and live for 18 years and then die in a car accident. But he was going to live for 18 years, excellent quality of life. And I walk into his hospital room, and I could tell something was wrong. He had his breakfast tray clutched, and I said, "Mr. Brown, what's wrong?" He said, "The oatmeal isn't hot and the milk isn't cold." And so you think of this, that he was complaining about hospital food. Now, I don't think anybody should be tortured with oatmeal regardless of temperature, but that's beside the point. But for a moment, he lost perspective on where he was. And because of that loss of perspective, all he could focus on was cold oatmeal. I think as we exercise faith in God, that helps with the loneliness people feel in the world. And so it's not just coming together, it is that as well, and that should be something that is done daily.
Since we're speaking about this loneliness issue, let me, I'm going to pose a question that was actually offered by one of the panelists. I wasn't going to ask it because it could be perceived the wrong way, but I'm going to bring it up since we've been pretty honest on the panel. It's the issue of high moral standards, which are expected by many religions, most religions, probably all religions. Take you to a new level, a little higher level. But with that sometimes comes guilt, comes the belief that you didn't do enough, comes sometimes misinterpretations, sometimes appropriate interpretations that you don't live up to. And that actually in some communities can cause increased risks from not being able to cope with the pressure, including suicide. And I would love the panel to address when sometimes it doesn't go the way we want it to go, when it goes wrong.
I was told by a dear friend in Baltimore that Jewish guilt is here, Catholic guilt here, Mormon guilt here. So I'm not sure if that's true, but I do think that we need to do everything we can to understand suicide. We need to learn more about it, and we need to completely understand it so that we can take remedies. But inevitably, at some point, it is somebody dealing with intense pain. And that pain is aggravated by loneliness, helplessness, and loneliness. Those things religion should be able to help with.
So it's loneliness, hopelessness,
and helplessness.
And helplessness.
Those things clearly aggravate that feeling of pain. And so a suicide attempt is somehow trying to end the pain. Religious communities should be able to rally around that and help with those things, in addition to recognizing that there's mercy, there's grace, there's forgiveness, that it's not an inspired thought from heaven to think that because I've made a mistake, I'm now worthless. The inspired thought from heaven is that you can change, and that you can up your game, that you can do better, and that when you stumble, that you're okay. It was, I think, one of the early fathers in the Christian era, Irenaeus, who said that God is like looking at a child who's learning to walk. And if he stumbles, he helps the child to stand and encourages, if I have that right. And I think the non-inspired thought is that when we stumble, then we're forever cursed and damned. That's not inspired of heaven. So I think that the issue of learning how to cope with difficulties and with mistakes, as well as having this community, really can be helpful. And I know you mentioned a study, as we were talking before. I think that would be very helpful.
Sure, there's a study that, or a number of studies actually, that corroborate the fact that religion actually doesn't increase the amount of suicide, but quite the opposite. So Andrew Sims, who's president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in England, said that an inverse relationship has been found between religious involvement and suicide behavior in 84% of 68 studies. That is, those with religious belief and practice are less likely to kill themselves. This association is also found for attempted suicide. Believers are less likely to take overdose or use other methods of self-harm. But just to comment on Elder Renlund's notion of belief and that people are not perfect, it's true. Religion encourages you to be the best that you can be. But religion acknowledges that it's a process and no one achieves excellence. And in fact, in the Old Testament is filled with the greatest of our personalities in our tradition that erred. Moses did not enter the land of Israel, for God's sakes. Specifically. So there are many, many characters, and the religion teaches that we will all err. It's not a question of if we err. We will err, some of us egregiously, some of us terribly, but we can stand up and rise again, and we can achieve greatness, just not only in spite of, but sometimes because of those errors, we achieve that greatness.
Father, how do you deal with the guilt that sometimes is felt? And we're all physicians, and patients will often believe they did something wrong that caused their issue. And sometimes there's a contributory element. But I'm always a little bit put off when someone's there's a report that someone has lung cancer, and the first question is, well, did they smoke? Right? Because and I've wondered about it. And I think the reason we ask that question almost reflexively is we're hoping they smoked, because that way, if we don't smoke, it means we're not going to get cancer, right? It's a way of explaining away how we're not in the same bucket they are, where in fact we're all in the same bucket. And in that particular example, increasing number of folks never touch a cigarette or getting cancer of the lung. But it's just emblematic of the bigger issue.
So just for transparency's sake, I'm not a physician. I'm a geneticist.
He's a real doctor.
That's right. Right.
Double PhD.
So, but we see that in genetic disease a lot, in terms of, I gave this to my child. It's my fault. And there's an amazing thing. I mean, there is this gradation of guilt. I grant you that. And in general, there may be Judaism and Christianity, but as now we know in precision medicine, you have to break out the subgroups. So the Irish Catholics are way up here. And how do you deal with that normal human instinct to say, what did I do wrong that is being visited on my child, right? And again, back in the Old Testament, that was something that the sins of the fathers are visited on the future generations. Well, that's the beauty of having an all-knowing, all-powerful God, who, if God doesn't understand, who is going to, right? And we've been, in these years of Pope Francis, emphasizing mercy. The gift of mercy that, as we've heard, is God's desire to give to us. Because God knows we're going to screw up. It is in our DNA. And that one we're not going to be able to fix by CRISPR. Pretty sure.
That's right.
So we have to acknowledge our own weakness, brokenness, incompleteness, and be open to the possibility that there's something beyond that, beyond ourselves, that we can be called to, that we can be brought to. And I think in medicine, in particular, when we talk about healing, right? And I'm sure the three of you have had these experiences. Certainly, the physiological element is extremely important. But to achieve true healing, you've got to get to that deeper psychological, emotional, and spiritual level, where the person embraces their own wholeness, even as partial as it is, as you said, on the way to being more of who we are. So one way to look at this is just ask yourself, anybody here not want to be better? Right? You ever ask anybody, like a crowded room, and say, anybody here not want to be better? And someone raises their hand? Never. Right? We all want to be better, whatever that means. So the idea is not that the desire to be better is somehow screwed up or wrong. It's how you think you're going to get there. Is it all up to you? Because if it is, then all you've got is you. But Cardinal Ravasi earlier mentioned the thread that we have between God and ourselves. But that thread is also a thread that connects all of us. And it is that interweaving of those threads, all connecting to God, that allow us to get beyond our own limitations and our own meager resources to that which is so much more. And so in a sense, I don't see it as religion. I mean, I'm sure it can be seen this way, religion imposing some kind of guilt, when really the goal is religion empowering people to recognize that we're all limited, that we all fail, and yet we individually are not responsible for the whole end product. We are to do the best that we can, to always want to be better, and to receive those gifts that God gives us from above or from one another to get there.
Just to, please, Rabbi.
I think one of the aspects that you touched on, Father, relates to why these studies may show that people with religion may live longer. Their coping mechanisms for disease are very different. And I think just one fundamental principle of why that is that we are completely comfortable not knowing all the answers. If you are a religious person, you will never know all the answers of your religion. We are trained that way, we grow up that way, we are weaned that way. And in the world of science and the world of disease, if you have that comfort level with, I don't always know why this disease was visited upon me, it tremendously affects your coping mechanism. If you believe, as the joke at the beginning, that you control every dimension of life, you need to know why, you need to know all the answers, you'll never be satisfied, and it'll impact your ability to heal properly as well.
I correlated both those comments is that so much of medicine, so much of healing, so much of what I was acculturated to, going through the training process, was about healing. But it does seem that religion is even more focused on meaning, even though all healing traditions had a spiritual element that I'm aware of, historically, even ones that aren't represented here. So how does that shift to meaning help the healing process? And how does it hurt to not have that backup? And this is going to take us into the broader discussion of how organized religion works with organized medicine. Elder Renlund?
I think that with people of faith, I think they're more likely to not allow themselves to be defined by their illness. I think if they see themselves as a child of God on earth to gain experience and to try to become better, then this issue of an illness is just one thing that they deal with, and then they just pray for the help and the strength to get through it, and they're asking, what can I learn from this, as opposed to, why me? Yeah. And so I think that would be my response.
I definitely concur. It's not just that we accept the unknown. It's that in all religious traditions, to some extent, in varying degrees, there's a belief when illness happens, there is a reason for that. So it forces introspection, and in many times forces action also. So let me take a simple example in the Jewish community. There was a Rabbi Eckstein, who's a rabbi in New York area today. About 40 years ago, he lost not one, not two, not three, but 4 children to Tay-Sachs disease.
Oh my goodness.
So one could pack it up and decide that their life is over at this stage. But he said, why did this happen to me? So he took it upon himself to start an organization to test people who are carriers for the disease. And if 2 people are carriers and marry each other, there's a 1 in 4 chance that they'll develop Tay-Sachs, the child will develop Tay-Sachs disease. He is single-handedly responsible for a precipitous drop of Tay-Sachs disease in the Jewish community. It's almost unheard of that now a child is born with Tay-Sachs disease. That's what he did. He translated the disease, translated the tragedy into something constructive.
I'd like to make a distinction here, and I know today and for the next several days we're going to hear a lot about cures, and I don't want to diminish that at all. That is an extremely important goal that we're pursuing. But healing is not curing, and I mean that in 2 different ways. Sometimes healing takes place, and I'm sure the 3 of you have experienced this too. The greatest times of healing that I have experienced have been during people's dying process. So there's no cure going on. There's no physiological improvement. But there was tremendous healing. Healing of ruptures in relationships that they had been suffering with for years. And it was only the experience of coming to the end that brought loved ones together and allowed them to surmount whatever the obstacles had been in the past. That was healing. By the same token, someone can be cured and never healed. Someone can experience something that so devastates their life and their understanding of their own self and self-worth that curing the problem doesn't heal them. It requires more. And so one of the things I think, again, that religion does try to take into consideration is this deeper sense of healing and the understanding that we're not limited in the healing potential, but whatever happens physiologically. That's obviously a key part of it, but that does not define what we can experience in terms of healing, just if the physiology goes one way or the other. We can be more than even that.
On a practical level, if part of your purpose is to protect the temple of the soul, part of your spiritual obligation is to manage this great gift we have, how do we get organized religion and organized medicine working more closely, especially dealing with some of the massive world health issues that we were talking about this morning and we'll talk about for the next few days? But it also takes us into CRISPR technology and what some of the cutting edge ideas are out there. Because I feel that oftentimes there's a disconnect where these groups don't interact. And I'm reminded of a hospital many of you have not heard of. It's in Camden, New Jersey, Our Lady of Lourdes. And this is a huge facility, actually. I didn't know about it, but I was going to give grand rounds there, and you walk into the hospital, and if you turn a little bit to the left, you're in the church. You're in the cathedral, and if you turn to the right, you're in the main science building. And you see similar splits in China. They have entranceways where you have traditional Chinese approaches, then you have modern approaches. So it's architecturally built in some places, but most places that's not the case. If you want to go to the chapel of a hospital, you need to find it. And it's not self-evident, right? It's hidden somewhere on the 5th floor in the back. It used to be a storage closet, and someone finally broke something out because nothing was there, and it's a little bit better than nothing.
My answer to this is very brief. It is conferences like this. That's the answer. The answer is getting together the great minds of medicine, getting together the patients, the physicians, the religious authorities. This doesn't happen often or ever. And this is the kind of venue that's required to really generate these conversations and dialogue moving forward. There's no simple answer. It's not going to happen in a day. It's not going to happen in a week. It's an ongoing dialogue and discussion that we are going to continue to have as long as we live. And based on our panel tomorrow, that could be up to 120, 130 years. We'll see.
Elder Renlund.
Just another aspect of that is that one cannot legislate moral behavior. One cannot define all the laws that will govern moral behavior. But what religions do is it's those Irish grandmothers who teach their grandchildren that there's a certain code of conduct, and that is something like the Golden Rule that's found in Jewish and Muslim and Christian traditions and others, Hindu. That is that you go out and you help each other. So a religion in an organized way is teaching individuals to have that caring heart as well as working at the organizational level.
And focusing on the organizational level, actually a little over a year ago, in December 2016, a conference was held here at the Vatican looking at the issue of antimicrobial resistance and the problem, the huge problem that is in the world today. And the reason it was held at the Vatican is because international and global healthcare organizations like WHO and the UN and others, Medicine Without Borders, Doctors Without Borders, excuse me, recognize the fact that the Catholic Church is embedded in many of those communities around the world where these organisms are picking up the resistance because antimicrobials are not being used appropriately. How do you engage with those communities? You can't just fly in on your jet and show up in your suits and say, you're doing it wrong. They're not going to listen. But if you have collaborators on the ground, if you have nuns who have been there for over 100 years working in those communities providing health care, you have a trusted colleague, trusted by both sides. And this, again, is an organizational way that we can leverage many of the resources that we have, which we haven't been doing such a good job coordinating in the past. And so I think there's tremendous opportunity. And again, not just in antimicrobial resistance, but across the board in all these technologies that we've been hearing. Because again, it isn't a matter of us bringing the technologies to these communities and saying, here you go, we're saving you. But actually going into those communities and finding out from them what their hopes and their goals are and how they would envision these technologies might be used for their own benefit. So we hear a lot about education. And again, I'd like to think beyond just education and talk about empowerment. How can we empower those communities to use these technologies well for the benefit of all?
All right, last question for the panel, and this is germane to the topic we'll return to after the upcoming break. That antimicrobial example is fantastic, and I completely get it. I know we've done this also, friends of mine have working with faith-based communities on AIDS management in Africa. I mean, when you just, no one trusts you except you can actually have a ombudsman, partner who is trusted. Let's take plant-based diets, where some of the faiths up here have strong opinions, others a bit more agnostic towards it. If medicine were to begin to think it's better for us and better for our communities to have diets that are more plant-based, lean, green, so to speak, how do you engage religious groups? Elder Renlund, let's start with you. How do you engage Latter-day Saints to make that a more overt part of the weekly discussions that are taking place?
One would teach it, and teach it and exemplify it, because we believe that people have choice and that they are just encouraged and helped. But I don't think there's anything more than the educational piece to encourage it. We don't force our members to live the word of wisdom. We invite them to and preach that they will receive blessings as a result. And I think the same thing would happen is that one invites, encourages, promises blessings.
I actually want to hear from all of you because it's going to come up, because this has become actually a religious battle as much as a medical battle on the front lines of medicine. And I say that it's no longer even a fact-based discussion. People think they're being pressured because someone else wants them to do it. It's like being spanked, and it's not effective, I don't feel. And that's why it's sort of interesting to see the role that religion could play in there. Rabbi or...
So I concur with Elder Renlund. Education is really the only mechanism. I teach in the Rabbinic School of Yeshiva University different aspects of medical ethics, advances in medicine. This is how it filters through. You teach in the training institutions, and then the rabbis go out and teach their respective congregations, and so on and so forth, and it expands in that way.
Father, last word.
So my goodness, the pressure. So two quick things. One, I think you can certainly use the science. Now, of course, you have to be careful using the science, because the science is sometimes going to surprise us. Again, if you went up to the Inuit or Eskimo communities and said plant-based diet, I think they'd look at you cross-eyed, and rightly so, because their metabolism is not based on a plant-based diet. And in fact, they would do poorly. So what we need to do is use our understanding of our own biogeographical ancestry and recognize the fact that most of us here came from civilizations or communities based on plant-based diets. Unless, of course, you're Irish, and then it was a six-pack of Guinness and a potato. But other than that, the idea here is getting back to what do people want, right? If people aren't interested in living longer, healthier lives because they're in a context where that just really doesn't make sense to them, you can talk whatever kind of diet you want. It's just not going to get through. You've got to engage them where they are. If you go in and you can say, we can improve your situation according to your own hopes and desires, and as you move forward, you might want to take this into consideration, that it would be healthier, more sustainable for your community and the world if you shifted to this approach. So you've got to hit them where they are. Otherwise, again, I think you can try a lot of education, but your education is already going to be focused on a group that pretty much is in your backyard anyway.
God bless you all. Thanks for being here.